Everyone. I'm Megan Lazovick. Thanks for joining us live today. So, do you see that chat window? Please greet one another and comment as we proceed today. It makes it more of an event that way. However, I have one request. If you have any specific questions, please enter them in the Q&A window. It makes it much easier for my team to see and respond to those questions. So chat in the chat, question in the question, and then we'll be good. So my team's ready, waiting to help. Thanks so much for your participation today. If you are watching a replay of this, we're still here from you. Send your questions to us at info@edisonresearch.com. Today, we're going to take a look through the podcast data that Edison Research has released over the past year, with a few updates and never before seen stats pulled just for today. The following deck is yours to share. Use it to grow your podcast, whether your show is ad supported or donor supported, or if you need to demonstrate the significance and value of the podcasting audience. Now, if you work in the podcast industry, I suspect that many of you who have tuned into this webinar are already familiar with the many strengths of the podcast platform in terms of reaching and engaging audiences. However, today we'll deliver the latest data you need to prove it. The podcast consumer will share how podcasts have achieved mainstream dominance and how podcasts reach every valuable audience segment. We'll also learn about how video podcasts are redefining the podcast landscape and all about the golden opportunity of podcasts because podcast advertising delivers ROI and trust. We'll also peek at the forward-looking trends that suggest continued growth. And finally, we'll review all the ways that podcasts offer a competitive advantage. Edison Research has been measuring podcasts since 2006. And in that time, we've witnessed podcast consumption evolve from fringe to phenomenon. It's beyond doubt that in 2025, podcasts have achieved mainstream dominance. If you tuned into Edison Research's annual webinar, The Infinite Dial, brought to you with support from Odyssey, Cumulus, and SiriusXM Media, you may recall this major headline: 55% of Americans are now monthly podcast consumers, a record high in 2025. More people than ever are listening to podcasts. We're seeing record highs by every measure. 73% of the population has ever listened to a podcast, and 55% are monthly podcast listeners, as we just saw, and 40% are weekly consumers. Through our subscription-based study, Share of Ear, Edison Research has been able to observe the shifts in the time Americans spend listening to podcasts over the years. And this observation is impossible to miss. Podcast listening has experienced explosive growth. Since 2015, the weekly time spent listening to podcasts has increased by 355%. I'll show you where that figure comes from. When we calculate the weekly time spent with podcasts through Share of Ear, the podcast listening from 2015 adds up to 170 million hours per week. By 2025, that number has increased to 773 million hours per week. That's 355% increase, which is equal to an estimated 603 weekly hours of podcast listening since 2015. Now, admittedly, there are smart people behind the scenes crunching these numbers for me. I had trouble wrapping my head around this one at first. But think about it. Since 2015, the number of people listening to podcasts has increased by millions. And we also know that those who do listen to podcasts are spending more time doing so. So if you consider that more people and more time, you see a massive increase in the total number of hours spent listening to podcasts per week among Americans. Podcasts have historical momentum. Here's a look at just how many millions of Americans are consuming podcasts. 210 million Americans have ever consumed a podcast, which is up from 89 million in 2015. That's a record high. 158 million monthly podcast listeners in the US is up from 46 million in 2015, also a record high. And 150 million weekly podcast consumers in the US in 2025 is up from 27 million in 2015. And yes, weekly numbers are at a record high. Let's examine some of that historical data. In 2006, 11% of the US population aged 12 and older have ever listened to a podcast. By 2019, over half the population had listened to a podcast, and this number continued to increase. The figure in 2025 is 73%, with one small footnote. In much of our research, we've noticed that video podcast consumption has been increasing. This year, we decided to ensure that we are fully accounting for podcast video consumption. However, with Infinite Dial's long history of tracking data, we cannot simply change our definition. We must expand it carefully. The 73% represents Americans aged 12 and older who have ever consumed a podcast, either in audio or video form. Most of them both listen to and watch podcasts. That small sliver of light blue, highlighting just 3 percentage points, represents those who reported watching video podcasts but didn't say they listened. However, to keep things simple for the remainder of this presentation, please note that our 2025 consumption numbers, unless otherwise specified, include both listening and watching podcasts. Given the significant expansion of podcasts, it's no surprise that they reach every valuable audience segment. Next, we'll look at some key demographics of the podcast consumer. Podcasts have a broad generational appeal with record high consumption across all age groups. According to the Infinite Dial 2025 study, 66% of people aged 12 to 34 are monthly podcast consumers. While this coveted demographic often eludes traditional advertising channels, podcasts offer direct access to these hard-to-reach audiences. And 61%, those age 35 to 54, are monthly podcast consumers. This group is extremely valuable to marketers. They have a large share of the market, they're digitally savvy, and they make significant family purchases. And podcasts are an excellent way to reach them. And 38% of those 55 and older are monthly podcast consumers. This category is changing as people age into it and bring with them their digital habits. But there's a good amount of digital adoption among this group happening too. The 55 and older category is worth your time and attention. They index high as spoken word listeners and are increasingly open to it in digital forms. Here you can see the monthly podcast consumption growth across all age groups since 2022. Growth has been consistent across both the 12 to 34 and the 35 to 54 categories. The 55 and older demo started slowly, but has made significant gains in the last year. Podcasts also reach a diverse audience. We again saw record highs among Black and Latino audiences. 58% of Black Americans and 51% of Latino Americans are now monthly podcast listeners. Monthly podcast consumers. Still correcting myself on that one. Here's the trending data for monthly podcast consumption among those demos. Black Americans' monthly podcast consumption rose from 33% in 2020 to 58% in 2025. In 2020, just under a quarter of Latino Americans were monthly podcast listeners. And today, the number has increased to little more than half. Podcasts boast a high value consumer profile. Monthly podcast consumers have higher incomes than the general population, with 47% earning $75,000 or more, compared to 43% of the U.S. population aged 12 and older. Monthly podcast consumers are also more educated, with 51% having college degrees, compared to 46% of the general US population. And weekly podcast consumers show high rates of business ownership at 18% and home ownership at 56%. I mentioned earlier that video podcast consumption behaviors influenced our measurement slightly this year. And that's a major theme for this presentation as well, because video is redefining the podcast landscape. Here's the whole picture when you consider Americans' relationships with podcasts. 22% have ever listened to a podcast but never watched. 48% report both having listened and watched a podcast. Only 3% reported having watched a podcast but don't report having listened. And there is the remaining 27% who have never listened to or watched a podcast. For the following few slides, let's shift our focus to video consumers. Video podcast adoption is significant across all consumption metrics. 51% of the US population aged 12 and above has ever consumed a video podcast. It feels as if some people are just now waking up to the opportunities in video podcasting. But I can assure you that the audience has been awake, eyes wide open, and watching for some time now. Over half of the US population has consumed a video podcast. 37% of the US 12 and older population are monthly video podcast consumers. And over a quarter of the US 12 and older population are weekly video podcast consumers. Video podcast viewers are more likely to use multiple platforms for podcast consumption, according to Edison Podcast Metrics, a study of weekly podcast listeners conducted by us at Edison Research. In the graph on the top right, the blue bars represent weekly podcast consumers who listen to audio-only podcasts, and the orange bars represent weekly podcast consumers who actively watch video podcasts. Remember, there's a good amount of overlap among these groups, but we do see differences when we compare them. Video podcast consumers are more likely to use computers and TVs for podcast consumption than audio-only listeners. That makes sense if you want to see video content on something larger than the small screen on your smartphone. However, what I find more interesting is the fact that video consumers are increasingly flipping from one platform to another. There's an increase in the use of devices overall for consumption. Podcast consumers who actively watch video podcasts are also more likely to trust the platforms themselves than they are friends and family when it comes to podcast discovery, with YouTube and social media posts serving as the places they most often learn about podcasts. And while YouTube is also the number one discovery source for those who listen to audio podcasts, they are also more likely to turn to friends and families for recommendation. Active video podcast viewers are also more likely to be younger and diverse. Here, we're looking at weekly podcast consumers who listen to audio-only podcasts on that top bar, and weekly podcast consumers who actively watch video podcasts on the bottom bar. Remember, these groups aren't mutually exclusive. Some people fall into both categories. So the differences between the groups aren't as pronounced, but we can see some. The age composition of the active video podcast consumers averages younger than the audio-only group. And here's race and ethnicity. The composition of active video podcast consumers has a higher percentage of Latino and Black audiences than the composition of weekly podcast consumers who listen to audio-only podcasts. And speaking of young and diverse, we recently released the Gen Z audio report from Edison Research and SiriusXM Media. And a few points from this study are applicable here. But make sure to check out the full report on edisonresearch.com if you haven't already. We know that video podcast consumers are more likely to be Gen Z. When it comes to podcast discovery, YouTube is the number one platform for this age group as well. 28% of monthly podcast consumers aged 13 to 24 use YouTube most for discovery, followed by social media at 26% and friends and family at 19%. And podcasts are essential for discovery as well for this age group. 43% of Gen Z monthly podcast consumers have discovered new brands or products while listening to podcasts. And 41% report that they pay attention to brands that sponsor or collaborate with their favorite podcast show or host. Podcasts drive Gen Z action. And that leads nicely to our next section, which focuses on the power of messaging on podcasts. Podcast advertising delivers on return of investment and trust. Podcast consumers have high ad receptivity. The latest data from Edison Podcast Metrics shows that 88% of weekly podcast consumers aged 13 and older agree that hearing ads is a fair price to pay for free content. And 68% of weekly podcast consumers agree they don't mind hearing ads on podcasts. There have been notable improvements in ROI for podcast ads in the Edison Podcast Metrics data. Purchase behavior from podcast advertising increased from 34% in 2020 to 44% in 2025 among weekly podcast listeners aged 13 and older. Some of the ad receptivity can be explained by understanding the relationship between podcasts and their fan bases. Podcast fandom is explored in detail in a study conducted by Edison Research with Wondery in 2025 called the Fandom Phenomenon. Information about this study can be found on the Edison and Wondery sites, but I'll share parts relevant to our conversation today. First, we'll establish a podcast fandom. For the study, we defined podcast fans as monthly consumers who rank 5 or higher on a self-reported 10-point scale. 83% of survey respondents fall into this category. So most monthly podcast listeners are fans. And here are some key stats about fans. 9 hours and 24 minutes is the average time fans spend listening to podcasts every week, compared to 5 hours and 33 minutes for casual listeners. 54% of fans agree or strongly agree that podcasts are part of their daily routine, compared to 11% of casual listeners. And 43% of podcast fans have engaged with podcasts through other forms of media, such as TV, books, games, events, and more. For this study, researchers got to tag along with podcast fans at some live in-person events. I had the absolute best time watching kids and their parents enjoy the Make It Wow event from Wow in the World in New York City. And it was a great example of just how much podcasts can mean to its fans, providing meaningful shared experiences. And podcasts elicit trust and influence among fans. 65% of podcast fans feel grateful to brands that support their favorite podcasts. 57% of podcast fans pay attention to brands that support their favorite podcasts. And 55% of podcast fans agree they are more likely to consider podcasts if the host recommends it. Consider products if the host recommends it. Probably the same for podcasts too, but I don't know the percentage here. I'll highlight one more custom study from our 2025 research, the Women's Audio Report from Edison Research and SiriusXM Media. When it comes to purchasing power, we know that women drive a significant portion of buying decisions across numerous product categories, and women are especially receptive to podcast ads. 75% of women monthly podcast consumers age 18 and older who have heard ads and sponsorships on podcasts have acted as a result of hearing an advertisement on a podcast. Women are now essential to podcasts and will continue to be important to podcasts in the future, which is the next topic of discussion. Forward-looking trends suggest continued podcast growth. Of course, we can't predict the future, but some trends can suggest how the podcast landscape might change over time. And we've selected a few notable ones. Women are driving podcast growth. Female monthly consumption has tripled in the past decade, from 16% in 2015 to 45% in 2025. And as female podcast consumption has grown, so has the number of women's voices at the top of the podcast charts. We'll use data from Edison Podcast Metrics again to understand the reach among women consumers. Now, Edison Podcast Metrics is the only podcast measurement service that measures listening, not downloads, across all networks, shows, and platforms among weekly podcast listeners. Women-hosted shows are increasingly dominant, with nearly half of the top 25 shows among women featuring female hosts or co-hosts, compared to just 40% among the adult 18 and older audience. You can see the women-hosted shows highlighted in purple on the right. Popular shows from the Q4 study include Crime Junkie, Call Her Daddy, Dateline, and Morbid. Technology integration is also changing the podcast landscape. 75% of the U.S. population aged 12 and older and have a smart TV in their home. And that technology, right in the center of the house, is enabling new consumption methods for many Americans. Here's the growth of the smart TV in just the past few years, from 61% in 2021 to 3/4 of the U.S. population owning a smart TV in 2025. That's an estimated 216 million Americans who own a smart TV. Let's pull up share of your data again to understand how podcast consumers might use a smart TV for listening. When podcast consumers listen to audio on an internet-connected TV, how much of that time is spent listening to each audio source? Among all audio sources available on the smart TV, podcast consumers spent the most time with podcasts at 42%. The second closest source is music videos on YouTube at 34%, followed by streaming music at 18%. So if you already have the podcast habit, it makes sense that you'll use the technology available to you. That's a behavior we may see more of in the future at home. But what about in the car? In the Infinite Dial, we asked participants if they ever listened to podcasts in the car, and 31% of those 18 and older who have driven or ridden in a car in the last month say they have turned on a podcast in their primary vehicle. We can look at the results of that question by all types of crosstabs, but here's a fun one. Only 22% of those with a car model year from 2010 or earlier said that they ever listened to podcasts in the car. And the newer the vehicle, the more likely they are to report listening to podcasts in the car. 39% of those with a model year 2021 or later have listened to a podcast in the car. There are potentially various explanations for this, but one of the obvious ones is right in front of you when you're sitting in a vehicle: dashboard technology. Here's that same question again. This time we compare the total population to those who said they ever used Apple CarPlay or Android Auto in the car. 44% of those who use Apple CarPlay or Android Auto reported listening to podcasts in the car. That's 13 points higher than the general driving population. As people upgrade their cars, their dashboards are likely to influence their listening choices. And I can inevitably expect my vehicle to break down one day. So I can also expect to see future changes in this area of podcast consumption. I hope that after all you've seen today, you can confidently say podcasts offer a competitive advantage. Let's review some of what we learned that supports that statement. Here are the reasons supported by data that we saw earlier why podcasts deserve brands' budgets. Massive growing reach, 158 million monthly consumers, and 355% growth in weekly listening in just 10 years. There's premium demographics, higher income, education, and purchasing power. And there's high engagement. It's not just background media, it's active, attentive consumption. There's the ad effectiveness, 44% purchase rate with high brand trust and loyalty. And then there's the possibilities for video expansion. This format is reaching younger, more diverse audiences. And finally, it's platform agnostic. Podcasts are available across all major platforms and devices. So here are the things to remember from today: mainstream dominance, valuable audience segments, redefinition thanks to video, ROI and trust, the promise of continued growth, and the competitive advantage. These are all the things you can tout when you are talking about the significance and value of podcasts and podcast consumers. We at Edison hope all this data will arm you with the information you need to thrive in the world of podcasting. Please share this research with anyone you think will benefit from it. And don't be shy to reach out to us if you have questions, large or small. I've spent countless hours conducting in-depth interviews and focus groups with podcast listeners and consumers, and I can tell you how much your work is needed and appreciated. And we at Edison Research appreciate you as well, as we have evolved and grown alongside the podcast industry. Thanks for joining us today for the Podcast Consumer webinar. If you want to receive regular insights and notifications on new studies from Edison Research, please subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Sign up at edisonresearch.com. We'll keep the Q&A box open for a few more minutes to answer any remaining questions. But you can always email us after the fact at info@edisonresearch.com. And I'll say goodbye for now. I hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks everyone for joining.